Hello, everybody. My name is Nick Werner, and it is my pleasure today to welcome you to another edition of the Georgetown University Wargaming webinar series. So today we have Daniel Hernandez Iniesta, who joins us from Spain and via Norway, and he's going to be talking to us about the political struggle in Europe during the 30 Years' War, uh, and how that interacts with a few war games and a few wargaming cases that he's bringing out. So I'll turn it over to him to introduce himself and to talk a little bit more about the subject. Go ahead, Daniel.
So thank you so much, Nick, and also thank you to Sebastian for the invitation. My name is Daniel Hernandez Iniesta. I'm from Spain, but I've been living for almost 8 years in Norway, where I performed my Master of Science studies, both international hotel and tourist leadership and international relations. I have been working with several student organizations, with the Norwegian government, NGOs. So that's something I really wanted to give back, on the political struggle when we talk about the politics. And the subject is nothing related to the religion, but religion was used as an excuse or the first tool to present what in reality was a geopolitical change that was already starting in Europe until 1648, when there was signed, the peace or the Treaty of Westphalia. So if we move forward, one thing that we have to understand is there was a really 30 years war. And that's the first question. And some people may say yes, some people may say no. And there are reasons to agree in both. Because when we see the context of a war, we have to understand that it's not how we understand at the end, it's how we started, which were the roots. But also, if we want to understand such a complex situation of war, conflicts internal between several nations, religion, politics, diplomacy, manpower, it's impossible to understand it in one single target. So we have to divide it into small pieces so it's easier to understand. And that's also a way that I reflected in my war game. It's a collapse which covers the entire war. It's in 5 different areas. So historically, it's really accurate because it marks a more clear areas between 4 or 5 years. So it's easier to understand, to analyze them, than in 30 years complete. And also in between all the areas, there is some connection. So everything is interconnected. But at the end, on 1648, the question is, the conflict was resolved. And that's something to discuss. So when we have to understand the conflict roots, the defenestration of Prague in 1618 is what is generally known as the start of the fire that changed the entire Europe. But even it was not the first defenestration in Prague, it was the second in the history. And from the sources that I have already written, could be argued that there was a third one. But that was a change in the political subject, because in 1618, there was a moment when the Catholic emperor that was based in Vienna wanted to make a change. But the stratum in 1618 cannot be understood from 60 years before, when it started with the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, which one of the main things that it was agreed, it was the cuius regio, eius religio principle, which in Latin says, which reign is the prince, it's all its subjects, all its people has to follow in its religion. So it marked a agreement of peace between the Catholics and the Protestants, but it was left other religions as the Calvinism and other areas. So when it started this conflict, it has been evolving from the French Wars of Religion, with over 30 years, the 80 Years' War, which started the conflict in the United Provinces, in what is known the Spanish Netherlands as well, which is now Flanders, and nowadays it's Belgium. So all these changes, it had a religion start, but at the end, what they tried, it was just to pursue a political supremacy. The Italian conflicts in between in Savoie, for Saluzzo, which is nowadays it's a small city, but it was a fortified city which had a strong control of all the paths through the Spanish Lombardy, all the way to the north, to Flanders, through Savoie, later on to the French county, and so on. There was a Venice, there was the papacy. So everything that was connected in this area had a root, based on religion from 1555. But everything tried to control the logistical routes as it was the Rhine connections. But probably, if we have to say when could have started really the war, it was in Clausewitz succession war or the conflict in 1609, 1610, which is near, on the border of the Rhine, which we see, on blue, on the map. And if it didn't really start the war then, it was probably because of the death of the King of France at the moment. It was assassination in 1610. So it slowed down, the conflict. But really, I think we could argue that the start of the war was in 1609, 1610. However, it's known as 1618. So when we think about the religious struggle from 1555 until 1618, it's really strange, to think that it couldn't started before if the conflict was already important in the area. So the complexity of the war, it has to be understood in three dimensions, both the political, to take control of the territory, military, to move the units, and to crush and to defeat the other, but also diplomacy. How many nations started the conflict? How many nations ended? And how many moved in between, join one side or the other? So even in my game, the collapse, I had to change the faction from Catholic to Imperial, because there were Catholics and there were Protestants. So, as you can see, the religion was used as an excuse to start a conflict, a political conflict. So the French support to Savoie, which we see in the green arrow, there was the connection that blocked the whole movement from the Spanish troops from the Lombardy to the north, up to Flanders, to the Spanish road. But also, a bit on the south, on the Swiss Confederation, through the Valtellina path. The English support to Frederick V of the Palatinate, which is known as the Winter King. The Austrian support to Poland against Sweden until 1630, but even before. So all these connections that led a start in 1618. But the naval and land logistics, it was difficult to achieve and to control by any nation. So you have to think to move an army of more than 12, 15,000 men. It was a real completely challenge. And that was an example that was organized a bit by the Spanish Road that started from 1567 with the Duke of Alva until it was formally blocked by France in 1635 with the conquest of Lorraine. But by 60 years, it was the main logistical route that moved armies, supplies, even money. But all this challenge to be organized, it was completely difficult. So the simplicity that we understand in a game, it was more complex in the reality. So what I tried to do as well is just to define in a more simple model, in a 30, 45 minutes gameplay, the Spanish Road, that it has been published at 3CI magazine with Roger McGowan right now. It's just to reflect in a simple way how challenging was to move armies. Not because of the route, that it has to be secure, it has to be able to move. There were some enemies, there were some small fortresses to conquest, there was some revolts on the way. So think how it was so difficult to move these armies, and it took about 30 to 45 days to move to the north. But there was units, there was mercenaries, there was leaders, there was armies, and the financial resources. So to fund a war and a conflict, you need the funding nationally. But this created internal stability. There was a naval impact to move all the ships across the sea if there was a war. And just have to think, I mean, moving armies by sea from the Iberian Peninsula to the north to Flanders, to Dunkirk. If France was at war, when England entered the war, how you can manage, I mean, to move so many armies, so many men? To maintain the blockade for Spain. That was on the other side. Spain tried to blockade the United Provinces' commerce in a way to reflect this commercial war. And that's what in the game is mentioned as the donkey privateer raids. There was the ravage, there was the forage. So understanding an army that was moving across the whole Germany, what we know as now in Germany, before it was the Holy Roman German Empire, the armies were fed mainly on the road. That's it's something reflected in the game. So you cannot understand how many units started the conflict and how many really ended. There's a statistics from William Guthrie that it says that nearly 80%, I mean, of the men that started the conflict didn't manage to succeed. We're not talking about the leaders and all the managers. But that was the direct finance from the units and the nations that participated from the start in the conflict. But there was external support. And people may think about France, and that was the main case. I mean, what they sent was the subsidies to finance armies against the Catholics to continue the war. But that way, to understand how complex is the system, you should understand how neat and important is in a war game to simplify as much as possible so it's easier to understand. And that's what I call, I mean, that's the learning by doing, that it's a principle from John Dewey. And it's on the way when you define a war game, you try to understand what it's within the conflict, what it's outside, what is not within the core system of the game, that in my case was the 3 dimensions, the conflict and the struggle for the players to reflect the conflict on diplomacy, politics, and military. And here in that point, I really suggest to everyone to watch the formal presentation from Clean Warren Davy that made the previous week about simplifying large-scale conflicts, which will help everyone to understand easily how much you can explain in a game and how much you have to remove. So it's simple, manageable, fun, and historically accurate. So the first area that we have to understand is the years, the starting years. So from 1618 to 1621. So from the differentiation of Prague, if we take for practical issues at the start of the conflict, however, as I said, I have to think that the crisis in Claes Jülich was the main reason to start at this point, until the intervention from Denmark in 1624. So if we see in red, we see the main areas that really was starting in the conflict in these moments. So for instance, in Bohemia, we have to think on the White Mountain battle, but the armies led by Bucquois and later the Tilly moved to join him against Christian of Anhalt. But something interesting to know about this conflict and this battle in particular, that there were also some Hungarian or Transylvanian hussars who were able to join the battle, but couldn't join it. There was some historical disputes between Guthrie and other writers if they really wanted to join, but they see that the defeat was coming and they just withdraw, but they couldn't join on time. We see in like the siege of Vienna with Hatzfeld, Thurn, and Gabriel Bethlen. Vienna was 2 times almost going to be conquered. The Upper Palatinate, Bavaria. It was, an area that was claimed by the Maximilian Elector from Bavaria as a way to pay the debts that the emperor owed him. And the Lower Palatinate, that it was just in the border of the Rhine. And this was the original area of Frederick V the Palatinate, who claimed the throne, of Bohemia. He was removed after the defeat of the White Mountain Battle. He fled to the United Provinces, but there was one historical thing to remember, that he was family direct from the King of England, from James I. He was married with one of his daughters. So once again, we see like other nations involved in the conflict, not directly. What now we understand is the proxy war, but in that moment of the 17th century, there was already proxy wars ongoing. And these in red are the main areas. So if you see like the line, it was all of them connected. And even the armies from Tilly, when defeated at one mountain, they moved to Upper Palatinate and they moved as well to Lower Palatinate. But Ambrogio Spinola moved as well. So it was an area claimed by several nations, even within the same faction, the Imperial, by Spain and by Bavaria. But that's not the only areas that there was in this conflict already happening. We see the conflict of the 80 Years' War between the United Provinces and Spain in the north, what we see in green. That already restarted in 1621 after the 12 Years' Truce. And in Italy, the conflicts coming with Savoy, but also the connections from the Spanish road and the Valtellina path that we see in blue. Those routes, were crucial to connect all the areas from Spain, to provide supplies, to provide men, and to continue the war effort. So trying to connect these two routes, it was very important for the Imperials, but at the same time for the Protestants, trying to block them. How can armies from the north, from the Protestants, could block them? It was nearly impossible because the conflict in red that we see didn't allow to move easily. So here it comes with the French support to Savoy, with funding to some of the cantons, in Switzerland, these small areas, to block this route. So we have to start, from the north. Now it's what led to the Danish intervention. From the Danish intervention to the Swedish interventions, we have 5 years approximately. It started in the north. But why Christian IV, the King of Denmark, entered the war? Mainly the reason was explained as to support the Protestants and to let them go back to the Peace of Augsburg, where there was unexpected respect between areas between the religions, which it was not respected, obviously. But how can an army from Denmark be formed and trying to defeat the Catholics? And that's what the point of the commercial and the funding comes again. Denmark was controlling the pass on the Sun. It was north, on Denmark, crossing to the Baltic. So it controlled all these routes, all these tolls, all this business of the seas moving across, provided a supply of funding so important for Christian to fund by himself the armies that marched south. But at the end, there was the armies that were victor, previously from Wallenstein and from Tilly that moved north. So he was defeated at 2 battles. It was, at Dessau and Luther. But we cannot forget, this green circle, because it shows a very important area in Pomerania, and especially with Stralsund. Stralsund was a fortified city, and Pomerania at the time was an independent duchy. Later on, it changed, the size, but to provide, a safe path to move armies to Germany from Sweden and from other nations as England that it was supporting with Scottish mercenaries within Denmark. So this was the central point of a sea route to invade Germany. So Wallenstein tried to conquer the city. Because probably it was one of the few cities in the north that remained not controlled by the Imperials. Wallenstein himself was was controlling the Duchy of Mecklenburg as a payment for his debts to the Emperor. But Stralsund remained independent, but not controlled by the Imperials. There was a siege late, but the siege didn't continue. And if you think that there was only few cities in the north that they were not controlled by the Imperials, the war could have been considered almost won. Denmark was defeated. So what changed the mind of the Emperor Ferdinand II? And that was the Edict of Restitution in 1629, where he tried to think on fulfilling the Peace of Augsburg, because there was some lands and some properties by the Catholics that they were not claimed between 60 years, or they were controlled by the Protestants. Difficult to agree legally, but he claimed in this edict, mainly about other issues that they were discussing in this edict, that these areas, these properties should belong back to the Catholics. So many Protestants who already control these properties were against this issue. And also Saxony and Brandenburg, who were electorates and were Protestants, but they wanted the peace in the empire, and they remained almost neutral or not aligned. But this was a real serious threat. So probably this was the biggest mistake of the Imperials and from Ferdinand II, because this led to the Swedish intervention in 1630 by Gustavus Adolphus, who was already victor from the wars with Poland. And also he had funding from the wars, because one of the important things is that he claimed the religious stability, but he really wanted to control the north of the German Sea, close to the Baltic, because if the Imperials could form a sea fleets to invade Sweden, that was imminent danger. So how he can provide an army to invade Germany? Because you have to think Sweden, which was formed at the time by Sweden, Finland, and part of the North Baltic. The population was not that high. So how he can fund that? It was most of it by his veterans from the wars of Poland. So they were well-trained soldiers and officers. There were also Scottish mercenaries. One of them is known as Alexander Leslie. But how he can finance a war and an army from such a small country? And that was because in the war with Poland, when it was agreed a treaty of peace, he controlled some of the ports of the Baltic. So he provided for about 6 years those and the income from those ports. We have to think that the main one was Danzig, which is the route to move all the grain from Ukraine, from the Baltic, to the United Provinces, to England, and to other parts of Europe. So with this surplus of money, he could fund an army. He was well-trained, he was experienced. He led his first army with 17 years in the wars with Russia. He fought against Denmark, he fought in Poland. So well-trained army. And with the excuse of supporting the Protestants, going against the Edict of Restitution, all the Protestants wanted to join him. So that's when he moved to Germany. All these green with these red areas, it was where he tried to control. with Silesia. He moved to Bavaria. He even sacked Munich, despite he was funded by subsidies from France, with the only condition just not to attack Catholic units, as it was Bavaria. But he did so. And also, if we have to think that strategically could have been more useful to move towards Vienna from Silesia, he also decided to move to Lower Palatinate. Says why? Because by controlling the Lower Palatinate, it was the main area of crossing from the Rhine with all the income that he could gain, but also to blockade the move from Spanish Netherlands, which is Flanders, to the north. So once again, we have to see of all these logistical challenges to move armies across. But as well, we have to think that he died in battle, in the Battle of Lutzen, after a great victory in Breitenfeld in 1631. So he died in 1632. So how can an army with his main leader, who was able to manage to gather the Protestants, or most of them on his side, could continue the war? There was so much experience in his army, in his leaders. Gustav Horn, we have to think Torstensson, Bernard of Saxe-Weimar. But from 1632 to 1634, the main moment that we have to remember, it was in this blue area, which it was in Nordlingen. It was a city controlled by Sweden. And there was two of the main Swedish generals in charge of the armies there. It was Gustavus Horn and Bernard of Saxe-Weimar. But the armies that moved across the Valtellina Pass, led by Cardinal Ferdinand from Spain, who was the brother of the King of Spain, and joined by the armies moving from Vienna by Ferdinand of Habsburg, which later became the Ferdinand III, the emperor. They joined efforts and they defeated the armies of Sweden. So which led to move the armies from Spain up to the north to Flanders. And they didn't use the Spanish road. There was a temporary truce with Sweden in 1635. It was the Treaty of Prague, which in general terms, the Edict of Restitution was revoked, and it was agreed to return to the Peace of Augsburg terms from 1555. However, there was already a minor war in Italy. It was the Mantua Succession War. Why Spain was involved? Why Austria was involved? Why France was involved? So trying to create another front of war, trying to create problems to another unit, another faction, but also to make the other faction use manpower and resources, funding there, not somewhere else. So in 1635, there was already a situation of peace technically, because Sweden was defeated or agreed to terms. So what happened next is what is called, what I have called the final French intervention in 1635. By the way, this map is done by Donald Hegarty, the graphic artist, and we have to think of every single area, every single city. So all the regions are not what it was in the former state, because the Holy Roman German Empire was formed by 370 entities of different shape. So in 1635, France had to intervene directly in the war, couldn't have on the back, couldn't continue a proxy war, couldn't continue the subsidies, because Denmark was defeated, Sweden agreed to terms, and generally we could agree that the Imperials had won the war, or were on the way to win the war. So they had to intervene directly, which was the first decision that they had to do. to take to block the logistical route from Spain to move from Lombardy to Flanders. And there was no need to go to Savoy. They had to invade Lorraine, which is in green, to block the route completely. So there was no way that Spain could move armies anymore from the Spanish road. So they had two options: to move across the Valtellina Pass, which was not easy, or to move by sea, which it was complicated by the war with France, but also with England. Later on, we have to think about the Battle of the Dons. But also there was some fun situation because Bernhard Saxe-Weimar, who was a Swedish general, who tried to control most of the area of Alsace and Strasbourg, trying to build his own duchy, suddenly died. And all his efforts, all his units, what they had to do? There was sponsor, they were funded by France, so France took this control of this area. But there was direct conflict with Spain from the north of the Pyrenees, but in the game it's reflected mainly in the north, in the areas of Calais, Picardy, of Champagne. And there was some really important battles. People, they remember Rocroi, where Condé won, the armies from Melo, who was the Spanish governor in the Flanders. But they forget about the Battle of Honecourt 1 year before, where it was completely the opposite. So the French armies were destroyed. So what changed, from 1 year? And that was, the need for Spain to push forward to Paris, trying to win the war and taking a gamble. But they lost. So that was the start of the decline of the power from Spain. But it was the start of the decline. There was already ongoing battles in Lens in the same area and in Prague in 1648. So Spain was not already defeated, but it was already very weakened. And if we think that's 1648, we have to think about 30 years of war with all the decline in manpower, all the problems to supplies, to fund. And I have to think that probably people remember the Treaty of Westphalia of 1648 as the end of the war. And that's commonly agreed. And the same way as I think this start was in 1609, 1610, what can be understood, the end could be understood with the Treaty of Pyrenees in 1659. But I have to think why. What happened at that moment? Spain and France signed the peace. They were the only two countries that remained at war for 11 years after the end of what we know the war was ended. So in 1659 was the first moment Spain was in peace for over 40 years. So these final years, from 1643 to 1648, it shows that the evolution of the war, they needed more manpower, they needed more men, and they need more resources. How you can achieve that in the war? Through diplomacy. This is shown in the game in the collapse by an opportunity for both factions to influence over the nations from Brandenburg, Saxony, the papacy, Hungary, England, but also for the internal stability of Spain, with a long-term investment declining in power and the resources that they received, but also with the foreign intervention to make able Denmark, Sweden, and France to intervene. So at the start of 1618, there were already experienced manpower, there were armies, there were funds. But in 30 years, they needed more. And mainly was achieved through diplomacy. So when we think if the conflict was resolved in 1648, I think already have made my point that I may have to agree on that for terms of simplicity. But personally, I think that could be argued that it was in 1659. Because in 1618, there was already a Habsburg domination from Spain, from Austria, with the support from Bavaria and the papacy. In 1648, it was already not clear. There was already France, in power. But until 1659, when it was not signed the peace, it could be discussed. But if we come back to our main decision, the main goal of why the war started, or why the nations explain themselves as why they joined the war, religion. If we see in the first map, that's the main religion in the areas of the empire. We see in green and Catholic, yellow Protestant, and blue Calvinist. And that's the main. They were already within other factions. So that was the decision to start the conflict. On the next map, there is some changes on the political situation. Territories that change side. In 1648, except with the gains from Sweden, in Pomerania, in Bremen, in Berlin, with some territories from France, there was not already big changes, besides also the Upper Palatinate for Bavaria, because the peace with Spain in the Treaty of Pyrenees in 1659, it made Spain lost territories in what is known Flanders. That was the main reason. So at the end, the change of the geopolitical from the Habsburg domination to the French domination in Europe, which is the geopolitical main change in the 17th century, it couldn't be understood in 30 years. It had to be understood in 50 years until 59, but also from the start of the road in 1555. So it's about 100 years conflict. And there was another map that shows the decline of the manpower. So if you see like in green, they were the safest, the ones that they suffered less. But if you see in orange, in yellow, there was a decline of 60, between 80% of men, the crops, and everything that they really need to survive the people. So it changed completely. In the game, it showed the ravage option as a way for people to learn about these mistakes. Because a war it's not, an easy thing to live. But I think that we have to understand this area, and we have to understand from the past all the mistakes that they will learn for trying to avoid the current situations, but also trying to learn from the past, not repeating the same mistakes. We started in 1618 with the defenestration of Prague. Could be argued that it was not the same situation on the start of the World War I in Sarajevo. There was, a local situation that could be handled in Bohemia, in that area, in the 30 Years' War, but within Austria-Hungary and Serbia in 1914. But there was the changes in the geopolitical situation, the need to support the claims, and at the end, we are discussing about political control. So I wanted to be short on the presentation, so I am able to discuss anything, to have any questions. I suggest to people to free to contact me with Nick, also to contact Sebastian, who can provide my email, so I have it here. People is free to ask me anything on Board Game Geek. I suggest also to have a look at the Spanish vote at 3CI. And if you really want to focus on the game mechanics, how it works, I suggest if you can join the San Diego HISCON online next Saturday. It's at 6 EDT time. It's 7 p.m. time in Spain and Europe, which you will understand how the game works, because today I wanted to focus on the history behind what drive me to design the games. And I have some more designs to come. The defense is the siege of Cadiz in 1625. There was a naval siege south in Spain between England, who tried to conquer Cadiz, and Spain. And it's very important that if someone really interested in this period who joins the advanced playtest, I am able to provide all the files. There is a Basel module, so all the help is more than welcome. So with saying that, I am finished with the presentation. I try to be short and concrete as much as possible, Nick. So if you have any questions on the people, feel free to
Yeah.
let me know.
And I'm going to actually unmute Cameron, who is one of our other folks here. But let me just start off by first thanking you for your presentation. Really informative. We don't hear too much about the 30 Years' War here on this side of the Atlantic. I think I can say that with relative confidence. But we did have a few questions for you. First, you talked a lot about kind of the background of the history, but what drove you to design a game about this period? What got you interested in the 30 Years' War and the wars of religion in Europe in general?
I think that in Spain, we have understanding of the Spanish tercios were the most important military units at the time. For 130 years, they were the winners. They won every single battle. So for me, as a Spanish, I didn't want it to think of one single unit. I think that the overall of the conflict cannot be understood with understanding that it was not Spain, it was, the whole Europe. So thinking Spain was the main power, it's not real. So you have to understand where are the nation's interests and the geopolitical changes.
That totally makes sense. And given the fact that, this is such a wide-ranging conflict, and trying to find details about all the different actors must be a major research project for you. What sort of resources did you draw on to inform your game?
Well, there was, an issue and topic that really interested me for a long time. And during the COVID lockdown, I think like everyone tried to design or just try to be creative, so just not losing your mind. So I tried for 1 year just to see which game I wanted to design myself. I know that someone else will say, I don't agree with this decision, or others. I already had some complaints on why have you put this city, or why you have not put the other. Well, as long as it's defined and it's clear on your design notes, it's fine. And I have also one friend that is working on a similar game with GMT, with Cuyo Reggio, Francisco Gradalle. He's a really good friend of mine. We have the same game and we just share, and he helped me. So for me, it's something that really interests me. And with that, yeah, I have to say, like, it was mainly with William Guthrie, Peter Wilson, but I have to say, like, the game will include a historical book with 6 scenarios, and as much as I possible, I will not be the one who writes a historical context. So people professional on these areas, on the Danish conflict, on the Swiss conflict, on the Italian conflict, could write about it. And there's already Spanish writers who really wants to have the historic introduction. So people have to see the history from a neutral way, from the outside. So I have to try to avoid myself to be so much in, because to avoid this influence.
Absolutely. Cameron, do you have any questions?
Well, thank you, first of all, for the presentation. It's very interesting. It's a underexplored area in wargaming, and it's like Nick said, it's a very complex topic for a lot of people to understand and to grasp. All of the front lines and all of the different actors. Well, there weren't any front lines, but you know what I mean. And so on. I'm curious, and I asked this because I recently read Van Crevel's Supply and War, which one of his main case studies is the 30 Years' War. I think it's his first major case study. about historical military logistics. So I'm curious if you have any more insight in how you modeled logistics and the supply of armies in this period, and what if there are major challenges in that.
Yeah, I mean, this game is mainly strategic. So there was some design approaches that I had to remove because it was not clearly strategic. So to define the logistics, I had to think about the connections, so how they move, the armies, also with the special connections, the Spanish Road and the Valternina Path with the sea movement that is also allowed. But the logistics in the game is defined as the resources that make the armies able to move, to recruit new units, to restore from battles, to influence on diplomacy. And that's the logistics that is defined, I mean, on the internal resources, but on the subsidies. So from the alliances. But on the logistics, the armies, they move across Germany mainly, and they could decide to ravage a region
Yeah,
to gain
right.
resources.
The forage, yeah, right.
So it's impossible to define for myself, I mean, the 30 Years' War without explaining what it was the foraging. It was a terrible situation, and I'm not trying to be nice. I mean,
Right.
but if we try to avoid the reality, we're not understanding the conflict to avoid the present future. And at the end of the turn, there's what they call, if you're not in one of the home regions, that if you remember from the map in red or in blue, the armies are outside the home region. So if you don't control the regions because you moved too far away and you didn't spend enough operations to control this area, then you suffer attrition. In the game, you suffer attrition for not being in a region you control, in battle, in sieges. So constantly you are losing men. So you are flipping units. And that's, you show the logistic challenges from the war, that what you start in the turn, it was you mainly finish. So it's really challenging.
Thank you.
Hope I answered your question. Or...
Yes, you did. Thank you.
Oh, oh.
So my question is, so where can we find the collapse? And I saw in the presentation you included the little small breakaway window for the Spanish Road. I wasn't clear. Was that a mini game that was within the collapse, or was that a separate project that was kind of in concert with the collapse?
This was it was originally published at a convention in Spain. It was in an A3 size. It was very simple made. It had a magnificent art, I mean, from Niels Johansson. And we just wanted to show in a convention how a game could be played easily with very low budget and easy play. So I tried to create some small games. This one, or the Defense, the Siege of Cadiz 1625, as a small games that people can play with. And this one, I mean, in the Spanish word, it's already available as a print and play on BGG. It was the previous version, but now it has been published in English at 3CI with a complete change in the art from Niels Johansson, which is amazing. The Defense from the Siege of Cadiz, there is something going to be published in English, so at 3CI next magazine. So I really encourage you to have a look at that. For the collapse, I strongly suggest for now just to check, I mean, the Wargaming page, because there is a publisher who is currently reviewing it, and you can reserve at no cost. But I write more updates about the game, I mean, at BGG. And also, I have to say thanks to Clint, which I reviewed his presentation, and he made me change my mind. I mean, some of the issues of the game, so I had to remove some parts. I have already a small mini game coming in with everything I removed, because the constant of the game is the struggle between diplomacy, politics, and military. But I had some things that it didn't really fit on that, so I removed that. So I encourage everyone on BGG. With this presentation, I have my contact, Unique, Sebastian, can freely provide my email, so I'm available anytime with any questions.
Awesome. I had one last question for you. So, there's nothing new under the sun with war games and with tabletop games. What type of, where did you look for inspiration in terms of mechanics for this game? Did you have a particular games in mind, or was it just kind of genre, or where did you start when you set about designing the game?
It originally was an area game, and it was originally with GMT. And even GMT and with Jason Carr, I mean, he sent me one of the copies from European Agony, who was the game in 2001, if I don't remember correctly. And that's the most similar that we can think. But the game mechanics is the CTG, but you are not forced to use all the operations for operations. You can use an event from the ops deducted. If you have enough operations, you can repeat the operations. So it leaves more flexibility. And this is a mechanic that I remember from Hearts and Minds. So it's a way that you use it. But the difference on the diplomacy, it's something that I really had to think for myself. I didn't have any background or any game that I can look upon. So I had to think how these nations, Saxony, Brandenburg, could join a faction, but within a logical and historical accuracy, but also leaving the players enough options to choose from and just take their bold moves and change their mind. So it's not a sandbox, but it gives enough historicity. So the track was really moving across. And I also have to say that I have been talking with Volker Runke, so he helped me with some advice, with some issues, but gaming, there was not many. So European Agony was the main one. And I'm glad that there is some more interest with some games coming in, but it's difficult to think about when the same topic is not reflected, at least at the strategic level.
Well, thank you. That was a great answer. I'll turn it over to Cameron if he has any last comments. Otherwise, we'll turn you back and we'll let you go to bed, Daniel.
Thank you so much.
No, hello. Yeah, I don't think I have any more comments, but thank you very much for the presentation. I look forward to I'll look stuff on Board Game Geek, and I look forward to hearing more about it.
Absolutely. And if anyone has the chance, I mean, San Diego is gone, I will present how the game works, so it's also a great opportunity.
Well,
I'll try to make that. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Sounds good. I'm going to go
Thank
ahead
you.
and stop the recording.